The morning sun bathed Ouagadougou in a warm golden light as President Ibrahim Traoré quietly stepped out of the presidential palace. But today wasn't like the usual days filled with official meetings and high-level briefings. Something was different. This morning, he had made a decision that would catch even his closest aides off guard and set off a ripple effect far beyond what anyone could imagine. What was this sudden plan that even his security team didn't see coming? Slipping into a modest brown shirt, he turned to his driver and said in a low voice, "Take me to the central prison." No media, no advance notice, not even a full security detail, just a simple, quiet visit. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly startled. "Sir, shouldn't we alert the prison? Arrange some protection?" Traor's voice was calm but firm. "No, I want to see the truth, not a performance." And just like that, the president's convoy, only 2 unmarked cars, rolled into the busy heart of the capital. Life on the streets moved as usual. Vendors shouted over their stalls. Children laughed and chased each other in the dust. And not a single person guessed that their head of state was driving through on a mission that could change everything. But where exactly was he going? And why now? After a 40-minute ride, the vehicles pulled up in front of the grim walls of Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. Tall concrete blocks, razor wire above, and silence heavy in the air. It was a place filled with untold stories and forgotten souls. The guards at the gate froze as they recognized the vehicle. One of them scrambled for the keys, his hands shaking. "Mr. President, we didn't know you were coming." "That's the point," Traoré replied, stepping out without hesitation. "Open the gates." Inside, chaos briefly flickered. The prison warden, Pascal Wedro, rushed over, sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the cool air. "Your Excellency, if we had known, we would have prepared the cells, the men, everything." "I'm not here for a show," Traoré said, walking right past him. "I'm here to meet them, the real them." Why would a sitting president willingly walk into such a place, unannounced? The narrow corridors echoed with distant coughing, metal doors clanging, and quiet conversations. A thick, unpleasant odor hung in the air, the scent of dampness, neglect, and lives left in limbo. When they reached the main cell block, something unexpected happened. Silence. Dozens of inmates, just moments ago sprawled across worn mattresses, or chatting in hushed tones, slowly stood up. They stared in disbelief. Was this really happening? Their expressions said it all. Confusion, shock, and for the first time in a long while, a flicker of hope. President Traoré didn't keep his distance. He moved among them with calm dignity, shaking hands, asking questions, and listening, really listening. Even his security guards looked on in disbelief. "How long have you been here?" he asked one man. 3 years, Mr. President," the man replied. "For theft. Do you have a family, a wife, and 2 kids?" "They visit when they can afford it." Traoré nodded slowly and moved on. Every encounter left an impression. Some inmates spoke openly, others stayed quiet. A few simply broke down in tears, stunned by this sudden attention from the country's most powerful man. But what would he do with all he saw? And how would this unexpected visit reshape the system? He walked past rows of cramped prison cells, each one filled with men clinging to fragments of connection, forgotten by the outside world. But as his steps echoed through the cold corridor, his eyes were drawn to a small, shadowy cell at the very end, where someone sat differently, quiet, still, alone. Who was this man who didn't even bother to look up? And why did he feel so different from the rest? Unlike the others who pressed eagerly against the bars to see the unexpected visitor, this man remained seated in the corner. His head hung low, hands resting loosely in his lap. His beard was overgrown, his clothes threadbare, and his posture said everything. This was someone who had long since stopped expecting miracles. But the moment the president stopped in front of his cell, something shifted. President Ibrahim Traoré, usually composed and unreadable, paused. The prisoner slowly lifted his head, revealing eyes that held not defiance, but exhaustion and something deeper. A kind of quiet sadness that reached beyond the walls of the prison. There was something about this man that the president couldn't ignore. "What's your name?" the president asked, his voice soft but steady. "Emmanuel," came the reply, barely a whisper. Like the word had forgotten how to be spoken. Just one word, but it would stay with the president longer than any speech. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" 7 years, sir." The number didn't just hang in the air, it pressed down like a weight. 7 years in this place. And yet, there was no anger in Emmanuel's eyes. No fire, just stillness. a calm dignity. That seemed out of place in such a broken place. What had this man endured to still carry himself with such quiet strength? What were you accused of? The president asked, sensing a story buried beneath. The silenced Emmanuel took a breath, swallowed, then finally spoke. They said I stole from my employer. But I didn't. I worked for that man for years. When money went missing, he needed someone to blame and I was easy. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way his voice came alive as he spoke. With every word, Emmanuel seemed to reclaim a part of himself, as if being heard, truly heard for the first time in years, had stirred something long asleep inside him. The president listened carefully, not just to the story, but to the spaces between the words. He knew what injustice looked like, but this was something else. What Traoré didn't know yet was that this brief exchange was the start of something much bigger. As Emmanuel continued, the noise of the prison faded into the background. There was only the man and his truth. I had no lawyer, he said. No one stood up for me. I walked into that courtroom alone, while my boss pointed fingers. And yet, here he was, still speaking with a calm that cut deeper than rage ever could. What the president heard in that cell would stay with him. But what he would do next, that would change both of their lives forever. Because in the quietest corner of a forgotten prison, justice was about to awaken and it had found its voice. He sat there, surrounded by high-priced lawyers in sharp suits, while I stood alone. The judge didn't even meet my eyes before delivering the verdict. 15 years. Just like that. President Traoré felt a chill settle in his chest, a cold, quiet anger starting to rise. But what had brought this man here? And why was the president so invested in a stranger's fate? I worked for him for 8 years, Emmanuel began, his voice steady, but his eyes heavy with memories. His name was Laurent Gouer, ran a logistics company. I was just a clerk on time, loyal, honest, never missed a shift. He paused, the hurt slipping into his tone. Then his nephew needed a job. The pain in his voice didn't need explaining. It was the sound of someone still carrying betrayal like a weight after all these years. What happened next? Why would a loyal worker end up behind bars? President Traoré turned sharply to the warden hovering nearby. Bring me this man's full file, every document, every scrap of evidence, trial records, witness lists, everything. The warden hesitated. Sir, it may take some time. You have until sunset, Traoré snapped. I also want the names of the arresting officers, the judge, and everyone involved in the investigation. The gears of power were turning now, but would they turn fast enough to undo 7 years of injustice? Back in the dim prison cell, Traoré looked at Emmanuel. Why didn't you appeal? He asked quietly. Emmanuel gave a dry, almost humorless laugh. With what money, sir? My wife left during the first year, took our children, and returned to her parents' village. She said she couldn't handle the shame. I had no money for a lawyer, no friends in high places. No one cared. The president didn't interrupt. He just listened, really listened as the reality sank in. This wasn't just one man's tragedy. It was the echo of a system that had turned its back on the powerless. But how deep did the rot go? Any visitors in all these years? Traoré finally asked. None, Emmanuel said matter-of-factly. I wrote letters for 2 years. Never got a reply. Eventually, I stopped trying. Learned to live with the silence. That silence now spoke volumes enough to shake a nation's leader. What would the president do next? That night, President Traoré sat in his office at the Ministry of Justice, files scattered across his desk. As he read, his jaw tightened. The case was a disaster from the start. Sloppy investigation. No real evidence. A rushed trial that lasted less than 2 hours. Then came the bombshell. Justice Amadou Diabra, the judge who had sentenced Emmanuel, had been kicked off the bench 3 years later for taking bribes. The very man who had handed down Emmanuel's fate was himself a criminal. What do you do when justice has been used as a weapon? Traoré didn't waste time. He picked up the phone. Dufresne, I need you in my office. Now. An hour later, Minister Dufresne walked in to find the president pacing like a man at war. I met someone today, Traoré said. His name is Emmanuel. He's been in prison for 7 years for a crime he likely didn't commit. He handed over the file, read it, all of it. And tell me, how did our justice system fail so badly? Could this case just be the tip of something much darker? As Dufresne flipped through the papers, his face turned pale. Fabricated evidence, a corrupt judge, no defense. And behind it, Laurent Gouer, using his wealth to crush those in his way. This is awful. the minister whispered. But sir, the conviction still stands. Legally, we can't just count words. Traoré cut in. Can't fix our mistakes. Can't admit we locked up an innocent man for 7 years. The minister fell silent. He knew there was no winning an argument with a man now fueled by purpose. What was President Traoré planning to do next? Here's what will happen, the president continued. Tomorrow, you'll form an independent review. Team prosecutors, defenders, human rights advocates. They'll go through this case from scratch. And I want Guer investigated. If he framed Emmanuel, he's done it before. And he had. What the team uncovered over the next 2 days was jaw-dropping. 5 more cases, all linked to Guer's company. All poor workers, all without lawyers, all quickly sentenced. A clear pattern of abuse hidden in plain sight for years. Even worse, Emmanuel's so-called confession, a forgery. The financial records used against him, tampered with. Traoré felt his blood boil. It wasn't just injustice, it was a system set up to crush the defenseless. Would there finally be accountability? We're not just freeing him, the president said firmly. We're bringing real justice and we'll make sure this never happens to anyone again. The very next morning, President Traoré returned to the prison, this time, not just as a leader, but as the man who had come to set things right. The media vans rolled in like a storm. Reporters, cameras, and legal advisors poured out, not for a press conference, not for a scandal, but for something the country had never seen before. Today, the president himself was stepping into the heart of a prison to right a wrong that had haunted the nation for years. What was about to happen inside those walls would shake the very foundations of justice and restore one man's stolen future. Inside Ouagadougou Central Prison, tension buzzed through the air. Footsteps echoed down long corridors as President Traoré led the group toward a single cell. Inmates watched silently, sensing something big was unfolding. The rumors were flying, but no one knew for sure. Meanwhile, in a dark corner of the prison, Emmanuel sat quietly in his cell. 7 years behind bars had crushed his hope. He had long stopped believing in miracles. So when he heard footsteps stop outside his cell, he barely looked up, expecting yet another routine check. But this was no ordinary visit. Emmanuel, came a voice he'd replayed endlessly in his mind over the past 3 days. This time, it wasn't just a name being called. It was a moment that would change everything. Cameras pointed toward the cell. The president stood at the door, flanked by legal experts and surrounded by the quiet buzz of urgency. Emmanuel blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. What was the president doing here? For him, President Traoré looked Emmanuel in the eye. I've read your case, he began, his voice steady but heavy. You weren't just wrongly accused, you were betrayed by the very system that should have protected you. Gasps echoed across the prison block. Inmates pressed against their cell bars. Some couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A president admitting failure. Publicly. And then came the words Emmanuel had stopped dreaming of long ago. Sorry, Traoré continued, his voice filled with genuine regret. Our justice system failed you. But today, we begin to make it right. He turned to the legal team and nodded. Emmanuel, you're going home today. The silence broke. Emmanuel's heart pounded home. He gripped the bars to steady himself. His voice cracked, barely a whisper. This is real. The president nodded. Yes, you're a free man. As the cell door swung open, Emmanuel stepped out, legs trembling, eyes wide. Cheers erupted from every corner of the prison. Some inmates cried openly. For them, this wasn't just Emmanuel's freedom, it was a spark of hope for their own. But what would the world outside hold for a man forgotten for 7 years? Outside the prison gates, a crowd had gathered. News of the president's visit had spread fast, and now people stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to witness history. When Emmanuel stepped into the sunlight, blinking after years in fluorescent gloom, the crowd roared. Microphones flew toward him. How do you feel? What comes next? Do you hold any anger? For a long moment, Emmanuel just stood there, overwhelmed, soaking in the sky, the air, the freedom. Then he finally spoke. I don't even know how to feel, he said quietly. I have no family, no home, no job, but I have hope, and maybe that's enough to begin again. Just then, the president placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You're not alone, he declared to the world. This country owes you a debt, and we will help you rebuild your life. But the story didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. True to his word, President Traoré didn't just free Emmanuel, He drove him personally to the presidential guest house. There, Emmanuel tasted small luxuries he hadn't known in years. A hot shower, clean clothes, a meal at a table that didn't come with steel bars. That night, as dusk painted the sky, the president sat with Emmanuel over tea. The titles had fallen away. It was no longer president and prisoner. Just two men, sharing a quiet moment. "What were your dreams?" Traoré asked gently, "before all this happened?" For the first time in years, Emmanuel smiled, not a forced smile, but a real one. "I wanted to be a teacher," he said. "I studied education before I worked for Gorat. I loved helping kids, giving them a chance to dream." Traoré didn't hesitate. "Then that's what you'll do," he said firmly. "We'll help you finish your education. And when you're ready, you'll teach again in our schools." But behind those kind words, the president was already thinking bigger. Because if this had happened to Emmanuel, how many others were suffering in silence? Over the coming days, as Emmanuel adjusted to freedom, the president began assembling a task force. A full national audit of the prison system. "If we could fail one man this badly," he told his cabinet, "then there are others, and we have a duty to find them." And so, Emmanuel's story became the spark for a nationwide reckoning, and a quiet reminder that justice, when it comes late, must come loud enough to echo. While leaders praised the justice system for maintaining law and order, something far darker was happening behind prison walls. Innocent people were wasting away in cells, forgotten by the very system meant to protect them. Inside a tense cabinet room, the country's top ministers sat on edge. A bold proposal was on the table, a full review of long-term prison cases. Some were nervous. What if it revealed hundreds of wrongful convictions? What if the public lost trust in the entire system? President Traoré didn't flinch. "Then, we fix it," he said calmly. "All of it. No matter how hard, no matter how humiliating, no matter the cost. Justice delayed is justice denied. We've delayed it for far too long." But what would that kind of honesty uncover? Keep watching, because what came next changed the nation. Just 1 week later, President Traoré stepped forward with a powerful announcement. The government would launch Operation Justice Lighter, sweeping national review of every prisoner who had been behind bars for more than 5 years, with a focus on those who never had a lawyer. It wasn't just policy. It was a reckoning. And one man, Emmanuel, would become the face of this movement. Not only a symbol of justice reclaimed, but a leader of what would soon become a national awakening. His transformation would inspire millions, but first, the country had to confront some painful truths. 3 months after walking free, Emmanuel stood at the podium of a packed auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou. Wearing a sharp white shirt and dark blazer, he looked nothing like the man who had once been forgotten behind bars. But the real change wasn't in his clothes. It was in his voice. Steady, strong, full of purpose. "I stand before you today not as a victim," he said, his words echoing across the silent hall, "but as someone who knows what happens when power goes unchecked and what's possible when leaders choose courage over comfort." In the front row, President Traoré watched, not as a politician, but as a citizen, proud of what his nation was becoming. Emmanuel's speech wasn't just heartfelt, it was strategic. He wanted to speak directly to the future lawyers of Burkina Faso, to plant a seed of change in the hearts of those who would soon be shaping the legal system. And people were listening, not just in that room, but around the world. Operation Justice Light was making headlines. In just 6 months, review teams had gone through over 2,000 cases. What they found shocked the nation. 347 prisoners who had been wrongfully convicted or kept in jail long after their time was up. Each of those cases carried the weight of a broken life, a lost chance, a justice system that had stopped doing its job. But the biggest revelation was still ahead, and it would shake the foundations of the legal system. There was a time when Laurent Guerre and a circle of powerful businessmen operated above the law. They used their wealth not just to gain influence, but to crush anyone who stood in their way, whether it was an inconvenient employee, a competitive rival, or an outspoken critic. They had a playbook: false charges, rigged trials, and silent witnesses. Bribes flowed freely. Judges were bought, evidence faked, and fear used like currency. But what happens when the tables turn on those who once controlled the game? Now Gorat, one of the central figures in this scheme, sat behind the very bars. He had once weaponized the same prison where Emmanuel had unjustly spent 7 years of his life. But when Emmanuel visited his former boss, it wasn't for revenge, it was for something deeper. Through cold steel bars, Emmanuel delivered a message that struck a nerve. What did he say that left even the hardened Gurrit in tears? Justice isn't revenge, Emmanuel told him softly. It's the hope that others won't suffer the way we did. You're driven by greed. Me punished in innocence. The impact of those words went far beyond the prison walls. President Traoré, deeply moved by the moment, made an unprecedented decision. He appointed Emmanuel as special advisor on prison reform and human rights, a role that had never existed before. But would a former prisoner really have the power to change the system from within? Emmanuel hit the ground running. His work took him from the country's biggest prisons to remote jails no one had visited in years. In each place, he carried two things: the authority of his new role and the quiet strength of someone who had lived through injustice. In the northern town of Dori, he found a man who had been locked up for 12 years without ever seeing a courtroom. In Bobo Dioulasso, he uncovered the heartbreaking story of 3 women imprisoned simply for being too poor, and with every story he uncovered, his mission became even more urgent. But Emmanuel knew freedom wasn't just about unlocking doors, it was about rebuilding lives. That's why he pushed for support programs that went far beyond release: vocational training, therapy, family reunification, and legal aid. As he told a gathering of international observers, freedom isn't just the absence of bars, the presence of opportunity. Justice must serve people, not power. Could this bold new vision actually reshape a nation? President Traoré believed it couldn't. He wasn't alone. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso began to transform. Legal aid clinics popped up in every region. Judges received mandatory training. And for the first time, the justice system started to reflect the values it was meant to uphold. What began as one man's nightmare had sparked a nationwide awakening. Emmanuel had once been just another forgotten name in a broken system. But now, he was leading the charge for change. Appointed as the head of a new, independent prison oversight board, he was determined to rewrite the rules, not just on paper, but in people's lives. The reforms didn't come easy. Some powerful insiders, who had long benefited from the old ways, lashed out. They called the president naive and accused Emmanuel of settling scores. But something stronger than politics was at play: public hope. As families found each other again and wrongful convictions were overturned, the country began to feel something it hadn't felt in a long time: trust. And just when people thought the journey had peaked, something unexpected happened. Exactly 1 year after walking out of his prison cell, a free man, Emmanuel stepped back inside Ouagadougou Central Prison. But this time, it wasn't as an inmate. The place had undergone a transformation. Clean, humane, living spaces, classrooms full of books, legal advisors helping inmates understand their rights. But one change stood out. The most: a plaque at the entrance that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied. Never again." Why had Emmanuel returned? The answer lay in what he was about to say. Facing a crowd of government officials, former prisoners, and reunited families, Emmanuel took a deep breath. His voice was calm, but full of meaning. "A year ago," he said, "I sat in a cell, thinking the world had forgotten me. I was wrong. The world hadn't forgotten it, just hadn't been listening." The silence in the room was heavy, every word landing deep. "Today isn't just about me walking free," he continued. "It's about making sure that from now on, every voice matters, every case is heard, and every person is treated with dignity." The applause came, but Emmanuel's eyes said more. This was just the beginning. Then President Traoré approached the podium. He didn't say much, but what he did say hit home. "Sometimes," he said, "a leader's greatest strength is knowing when to follow." Emmanuel has taught this nation more about justice than any book ever could. His voice was steady, but his eyes showed respect that words couldn't capture. But what happened after the speeches left the deepest mark? As the ceremony ended, and the crowd slowly drifted away, Emmanuel stayed behind for a moment. He stood quietly, outside what used to be his prison cell. But it wasn't a cell anymore, it had been turned into a library. Inside, sunlight spilled across rows of books on human rights, law, and justice. What was once a symbol of silence and isolation had become a space for learning and hope. What did Emmanuel feel in that moment? It wasn't anger, it was something more powerful. Walking away from the prison for the last time, Emmanuel didn't carry bitterness for the years he had lost. Instead, he carried something rare and precious: hope. Hope for a system that listens. Hope for futures not yet written. Hope for a justice that never stops growing. Because, as Emmanuel had learned, justice isn't a finish line, it's a path. One that demands courage, compassion, and the willingness to hear the voices too often ignored. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky over Ouagadougou in shades of gold and violet. A new chapter began, not just for Emmanuel, but for an entire nation stepping forward into a more just tomorrow.